Welcome to Attic Static. Tonight we have 20 stories for you, including the Rotational Echo, the half-second delay, the Weaver of the Permafrost, and more. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let the rain carry you. The Rotational Echo. Scene 1. I never meant to be the one who started this chain. It began with a simple recording of a roadside motel, the old motor court on Highway 42, now bypassed by the new interstate. I just wanted to capture the silence. My voice was steady as I spoke into the recorder. It is 3 a.m. and the air tastes like copper. Scene 2. When I played it back that night, something felt off. My pitch was correct, but my vowels had a slight thickness to them, as if they were being pulled through honey. It wasn't a glitch in the machine. It was as if my own mouth had learned how to shape my words in a way that wasn't entirely human. Scene 3. I returned to the motor court the next day. The courtyard was a graveyard of shuttered rooms, their wooden doors painted a peeling teal. In the center stood the figure. It didn't walk or glide. It stood perfectly still in the middle of the pavement, then began to rotate on its own axis. It moved like the hand of a clock, smooth, constant, and mechanical. It was tall, with a torso shaped like an elongated ribbed cage and skin that looked like hammered bronze. Scene 4. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Instead, it had a single horizontal slit where eyes should be, glowing with a soft amber warmth. Its limbs were thick and segmented, resembling those of a prehistoric insect. As I watched it rotate, the sound of its movement was a low hum, like a cello string being bowed underwater. Scene 5. I decided to record my reaction. "You were moving quite smoothly," I whispered. When I listened back later, the horror hit me first. My voice was there, but the cadence was wrong. It sounded like my voice had been stretched out and layered over itself 3 times. It wasn't just a recording anymore. It was an imitation that was starting to steal my identity. Scene 6. I spent the next hour watching it rotate. Every time it completed a full circle, it seemed to get slightly taller. By the 4th rotation, its bronze skin began to ripple. I realized it wasn't just moving, it was reacting to being observed. It began to rotate faster, and my voice in the recording started to crackle with a strange, rhythmic pulse. Scene 7. I spoke again into the recorder, trying to steady my breathing. "Are you listening?" I asked. When I played it back, my own voice sounded heavy. It had gained a weight that didn't belong to me. It was as if someone else was using my vocal cords as a rehearsal space. The voice on the tape began to sound less like a human speaking and more like an echo trying to find its way home. Scene 8. The figure suddenly stopped rotating. It stood perfectly upright, facing me. For the first time, it opened its horizontal slit. A sound emerged, not from its mouth, but from the air around it. It was my voice saying, "Are you listening?" But the tone was now entirely alien. It was deeper, more resonant, and lacked the slight breathiness of my actual speech. Scene 9. I grabbed the recorder to stop it, but as I did, a new recording played automatically. It wasn't one of mine. It was a voice that sounded like me, yet perfectly distinct, a version of me that spoke with a hollow, metallic resonance. The figure began to rotate again, faster this time, its bronze ribs clacking together like a deck of cards being shuffled. Scene 10. I stood frozen as the hum filled my ears. I realized then that the voice on every recording wasn't just changing, it was migrating. It was leaving my throat and inhabiting the air around me. I looked down at the recorder in my hand, but when I listened to the final second of tape, there was no sound of a human at all. The voice on the recording spoke with my perfect inflection, yet it belonged to something that hadn't been born yet. I realized then that my own voice was becoming the ghost, and whatever was inhabiting my throat was preparing to take its turn. The half-second delay. Scene 1. The platform was a skeletal ruin of timber and whetstone, stretching out into a valley where the rain fell in steady, rhythmic pulses. There were no tracks left to follow, just the ghost of an old railway that had been reclaimed by the weeds years ago. I stood there alone, my boots sinking into the mud, watching the way the water pooled in the grooves of the wood. It was perfectly silent, save for the hiss of the rain hitting the grass. Scene 2. In the middle of a vast, swaying field beyond the platform sat a door. It had no frame and no walls attached to it. It simply stood upright, a heavy slab of weathered oak with a brass handle that gleamed even in the dim light. Looking through the keyhole, I didn't see more grass. I saw a sky of deep violet, swirling with clouds that moved faster than any wind on Earth. Scene 3. A faded flyer was taped to the door's surface. It depicted a man who had vanished 3 months prior. As I approached it, my breath hitched. Taped next to his face were several small notes, each one added by whoever found him last. The first note read, "It moves when you do." Scene 4. I reached out to touch the brass handle, and that was when I saw myself. It wasn't a mirror, but as I stood before the door, my reflection appeared on its surface like a painting come to life. However, it wasn't moving in perfect synchronization with me. When I blinked, my reflection stayed wide-eyed for a fraction of a second longer. When I took a breath, its chest rose just a heartbeat after mine. Scene 5. The second note on the flyer read, "It is hungry for your timing." I moved my right hand to grip the handle. My reflection followed, but there was a perceptible delay, a tiny, rhythmic lag as if it were trailing behind me in time. It wasn't just copying my movements, it was chasing them. Scene 6. The rain began to feel heavier, more deliberate. I stepped back, and the reflection stepped back a half-second later. Each movement felt like a tiny tug on an invisible thread. I realized that while I was moving in real time, the entity inside the door was inhabiting a slightly slower dimension, closing the gap with every motion I made. Scene 7. The third note read, "It is gaining ground." I noticed something strange about its physical form. My reflection didn't have my exact features. Its hair was thick and coiled like copper wire, and instead of my pupils, it had a series of concentric circles that pulsed with a soft amber light. It looked less like a twin and more like a predator perfecting a mimicry. Scene 8. I tried to remain perfectly still to see if it would stop. But even in total stillness, the reflection was creeping forward. It wasn't just following my posture, it was inching toward the front of the door's surface. Its copper coils swayed slightly as if caught in a breeze that didn't exist in our world. Scene 9. The fourth note read, "When it touches you, the delay ends." Panic surged. I realized that every time I moved faster, it gained more ground. If I swung my arm wide, it would eventually meet me halfway. I stood before the door, trembling, watching those concentric circles pulse faster as it reached for my nose from inside the wood. Scene 10. With a sudden jerk, I lunged forward and slammed my palm against the center of the door. The reflection's hand met mine with a solid thud, not as a phantom touch, but as a physical collision. In that instant, the delay vanished. My hand fused with its hand, and for one heartbeat, we were perfectly synchronized. Then it surged forward out of the wood, grabbing my wrist with a grip that felt like cold velvet. It didn't just copy me anymore, it pulled me into the violet sky, and as I felt myself being dragged through the threshold, I realized that while I was now in its world, I could still see my own reflection frozen on the outside of the door, waiting for its turn to move. The Weaver of the Permafrost. Come closer, little one. Pull your blanket up to your chin, because I want to tell you about the time my grandfather lived at the edge of the world, that frozen wasteland where the sun refuses to sleep and the ground stays hard as iron. He lived in a drilling camp buried deep in the permafrost, a place of humming machines and whistling wind. In those early weeks, everything was white and silent. But on the 14th day, something started to change. The drill hit a pocket of ancient air, and from that crack came a sound, a rhythmic, wet clicking. It sounded like 1,000 tiny teeth tapping against stone. That was when he first saw the fox. It wasn't a normal fox. Its fur was the color of bruised plums, and it had an odd way of moving. It didn't trot so much as glide, its paws barely touching the snow. Every evening at dusk, the fox would sit exactly 30 paces from his tent. It wouldn't hunt for mice or birds. It simply watched him with wide, amber eyes that seemed to hold a heavy secret. By the second week, the fox began to behave strangely. It stopped watching from a distance and started running in circles around the perimeter of the camp. Every time it finished a lap, it would let out a sharp, melodic trill, a warning, he realized. Then, the clicking sound grew louder. One night, As the midnight sun hung like a heavy gold coin in the sky, the fox did something peculiar. It stopped its circles and sat perfectly still, facing the deep trench where they were drilling. It let out a low whine and flicked its tail twice. Then, it vanished into the shadows of the crates. My grandfather stood up, his breath blooming in the frigid air. "Stay back," the fox seemed to say with its posture alone. He felt a prickle on his neck. He looked toward the trench, where the shadow was lengthening unnaturally. Out of the dark rose something that shouldn't have been there. It emerged from the permafrost like a blooming flower made of debris. It was an entity woven entirely from discarded pieces of life. Imagine a creature with a body built from thousands of strands of human hair, gold, black, and white, intertwined like thick vines. Instead of skin, it had patches of overlapping fingernails that shimmered like beetle wings. It didn't have a face in the traditional sense. Its head was a dense cluster of tangled locks, and where a nose should be, there was a jagged protrusion of a thumbnail. It moved with a fluid, jerky motion, dragging its mass across the ice. The hair rippled like seaweed in an ocean current. As it drew closer, my grandfather realized why the fox had been warning him. The creature wasn't just walking, it was feeding on the silence of the camp. The fox darted forward, nipping at the air between the man and the weaver. It stayed between them, its tail twitching in a frantic rhythm. "Is it hungry?" my grandfather whispered to himself. The entity responded by vibrating, making the hair on its body hum with a low, resonant frequency that made the very ground tremble. It reached out with a limb made of braided hair and a handful of sharp nails, reaching toward his shoulder. It didn't grab him, it simply touched the air just inches from his skin, as if testing his warmth. The fox gave one final, piercing yelp and retreated to his side, its fur standing on end. My grandfather stood frozen as the weaver arched its back. Then, with a sudden, violent jerk, the creature folded in on itself like a collapsing chair and sank into the permafrost, leaving only a few stray strands of hair resting on the ice. The fox looked at the man once more, gave a final nod, and then disappeared into the white expanse. He returned to his tent that night, shivering not from the cold, but from the realization of what he had seen. He sat in the dark, listening to the wind, knowing that somewhere beneath the ice, the weaver was waiting for its next piece of hair to fall. But as he closed his eyes, he realized the clicking hadn't stopped with the creature's descent. It was moving closer now, not from the trench, but from the ceiling of his tent. A single strand of black hair drifted down from the shadows above and touched his forehead. He opened his eyes to see a new set of amber eyes peering from the rafters, and he realized that while the weaver was waiting for hair to fall, it had finally reached out to claim his. The Filament Feed. Scene 1. I took the night shift at the St. Jude's Archive, a library so old the dust felt like velvet against my skin. It was a sprawling labyrinth of mahogany shelves and leather-bound spines. The townspeople called it the quiet place, but at 9 p.m., after the heavy oak doors groaned shut, the silence became something physical, a weight that pressed against my eardrums. I sat at the central circulation desk, the only piece of furniture that felt anchored in a sea of towering books. Scene 2. To manage the building's atmosphere, we installed an automated smart home feed called Lumina. It was a series of interconnected sensors and bulbs designed to react to movement. I had set it up to be simple: turn on when someone entered, dim when they sat still. But tonight, the lights were behaving erratically. As I pulled my first book from the shelf, the chandelier above flickered once, not because of a breeze, but as if something had tripped a switch in the rafters. Scene 3. I opened my phone to check the Lumina app. It was designed to log every light change with a timestamp and a brief narration. I scrolled through the first few minutes of the shift. 8:01 p.m. The main hall is dimming. 8:05 p.m. The reading nook is brightening. I frowned. I hadn't moved toward the reading nook yet. In fact, I was still standing by the biography section. The app continued to scroll. 8:12 p.m. A heavy weight settles on the velvet chair in the corner. There were no chairs in that corner, only a pedestal for a marble bust of a forgotten poet. Scene 4. I walked toward the pedestal, my sneakers squeaking on the linoleum. The silence was broken by a low hum, like a distant beehive. As I reached the pedestal, the overhead lights didn't just dim, they pulsed in a rhythmic wave, traveling from left to right across the ceiling. Then, the Lumina feed chirped with a new entry. 8:15 p.m. The bust is turning its face toward the door. I froze. The marble bust was fixed on a stone base, perfectly stationary. I stared at it, waiting for it to move, but it remained as still as a tombstone. Scene 5. Then I heard it, the first voicemail notification from the app. It wasn't just text anymore. Lumina had started recording audio events. I pressed play. A voice, dry and crackling like parchment rubbing together, whispered through my phone speakers. You are standing 3 feet from the bust, wondering why it hasn't moved yet. My heart hammered against my ribs. I hadn't spoken a word since arriving. Scene 6. The room grew colder. The lights began to behave even more strangely. They weren't just dimming. They were being sucked into something in the center of the room. Every bulb in the ceiling seemed to lean inward, as if gravity had shifted. In the middle of the floor, a shape began to coalesce out of the shadows. Scene 7. It was an entity made entirely of dead light bulbs, thousands of them, suspended in a shimmering, translucent web of glass threads. It didn't have a solid body. It was a cluster of frosted globes and clear filaments, some glowing with a faint amber hue, others completely dark. It moved like a jellyfish through water, its bulb clusters swaying as it drifted toward me. Scene 8. As the entity approached, the room plunged into near total darkness. The creature was drinking the light. Wherever it touched a surface, the glow vanished, swallowed by its glassy body. I watched in awe as it reached out with a cluster of flickering filaments and brushed against my shoulder. It felt like touching 1,000 tiny, warm beads of glass. Scene 9. I checked the Lumina app one last time. The narration was moving so fast now that the text blurred. 8:24 p.m. It is reaching for your shoulder. Backslash 8:25 p.m. It is tasting the warmth of your skin. Backslash 8:26 p.m. It is hungry for the light in your eyes. Backslash the entity hummed, a vibrating sound that shook the very shelves. It pulled closer, its filament threads weaving around my head like a halo of shattered stars. Scene 10. I reached out to touch one of its glowing bulbs, but as my finger made contact, the entire room went pitch black. The entity had consumed every single scrap of light in the library, including the glow from my phone screen. In the absolute void, a new voicemail played on its own. Thank you for letting me feast. When I blinked, the entity was gone, but I could still feel the lingering warmth of the glass against my cheek, and I realized that now that it had finished eating the light in the room, it was looking for the light inside me. The transit of the missing hour. Scene 1. The depot. I am the night shift supervisor at Route 9, a bus depot that breathes in the heavy scent of diesel and old upholstery. My world is defined by the hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock, a towering piece of mahogany that sits against the far wall of the dispatch room. It is my constant companion during the 3-hour lull between midnight and 3 a.m. At first, it was just a tool for keeping schedule, but as the weeks passed, I began to notice its peculiar rhythm. Scene 2. The discrepancy. One Tuesday, at exactly 1 a.m., I looked at my wristwatch and then at the grandfather clock. Both read 1 o'clock perfectly. I took a sip of lukewarm coffee. When I looked back up 10 seconds later, the clock had jumped. It didn't tick forward. It simply surrendered an hour. The hands were now at 2 a.m., yet my watch and my own internal sense of time remained firmly anchored at 1 a.m. Scene 3. The persistence. I frowned, checking the mechanical gears to see if a tooth had slipped. Everything was seamless. I blinked, and in that blink, 60 minutes evaporated into thin air. It was as if the world had taken a deep breath and held it for an hour while I remained suspended in the middle of an exhale. I checked my watch again. It still read 1 a.m. The room felt slightly cooler, a faint draft smelling of damp stone blooming from the floorboards. Scene 4. The corridor. To reach the break room from the dispatch desk, there is a narrow corridor. It is exactly 20 paces long. I have paced it out until my feet ache. On this night, I decided to walk down it to grab a fresh mug. I stepped into the hallway, counting each stride as I went. 1, 2, 3. By the time I reached the door of the break room, I had counted 20. It felt like a standard walk. Scene 5. The return trip. I returned from the break room, my mug held firmly in both hands. I stepped back into the corridor to head toward the desk. I began to count again. 1, 2, 3. But by the time I reached the halfway point, my heart skipped. I had only counted 10 paces, yet I was still exactly in the middle of the hallway. It felt as though the floor were stretching beneath my boots like taffy. Scene 6. The expansion. I kept walking. 10 more paces. And then 5. Then 3. By the time I reached the dispatch desk, I had counted 42 paces to travel a distance that should have only taken 20. The corridor was growing. It wasn't just getting longer, it felt wider in parts, with the walls curving slightly outward as if the hallway were trying to accommodate something massive pressing against its sides. Scene 7. The observation. I stopped in the center of the stretched hallway and looked back at the dispatch room. The door was still there, but it looked smaller, further away than it had been a moment ago. I realized that the corridor wasn't just expanding, it was reacting to my presence. Every time I blinked, the far wall seemed to retreat an inch further into the gloom. Scene 8. The voice in the wood. As I stood there, paralyzed by the geometry of the hallway, a sound emerged from the ceiling, a soft, rhythmic scraping, like a heavy velvet curtain being dragged across stone. Then came a voice, resonant and muffled as if speaking through a thick layer of water. "Do not hurry," it whispered. It didn't come from the room ahead or behind. It came from the hallway itself. Scene 9. The final walk. I took a deep breath and forced myself to walk toward the desk again. This time, I didn't count. I simply moved. The walls pulsed with a dull, amber light. Every step felt heavy, as if I were wading through knee-deep water. The hallway stretched until it was nearly a minute of walking just to reach the desk. When my hand finally touched the wood of the dispatch table, I realized that for those 60 missing minutes, I hadn't been standing still, I had been traveling through the expansion. Scene 10. The resolution. I sat down heavily and looked at the grandfather clock. It now read 3 a.m. My watch, however, still stubbornly displayed 1 a.m. I realized then that the clock didn't lose an hour. It simply spent that hour exploring the corridor while I was busy living inside it. I looked at the door to the hallway and noticed a new detail. A small, wet footprint on the floorboards where none had been before. It wasn't my footprint. It was much larger, shaped like a hoof, and it was still slowly sliding toward me. The echo of the unmapped road. If you find yourself stationed at the outpost, do not be fooled by its silence. It is a deep, heavy quiet, located so far from civilization that the nearest paved road feels like a memory rather than a physical reality. To survive your first night here, follow these instructions carefully. First, prepare your senses. The forest doesn't just surround the station, it presses against the timber walls. You will hear the pine needles groan under the weight of invisible wind. Second, keep your lantern fueled. The light is your primary anchor to reality. Third, listen for the voice. It begins around midnight. It is not a human voice, but a navigation system that seems to emanate from the very air. It lacks the mechanical perfection of a radio. Instead, it sounds like a choir of hummingbees trying to pronounce vowels. It will tell you where to go. Turn left at the cedar spire, it will murmur. Continue for 300 paces until the dirt turns to velvet. You will notice something peculiar about these directions. There are no landmarks on your physical map that match its descriptions. The voice is navigating a geography that exists only in the moment you hear it. It steers you toward roads that aren't there, yet as you walk them, the ground firming beneath your boots becomes absolute. Fourth, watch for the mimic. This is the most vital rule of survival. As the voice begins its navigation, a figure will emerge from the shadows of the rafters. It does not look like a ghost or a person. It looks like a sculpture made of woven wicker and wet clay. Its body is textured with tiny, protruding bumps that catch the lantern light. It has no face in the traditional sense, just a series of concentric ridges where eyes should be, and a mouth shaped like a crescent moon. At first, you will ignore it. But then, you will notice its posture. The mimic does not move on its own initiative. It copies you. If you raise your right hand to shield your eyes from the gloom, the mimic raises its own. If you lean forward in curiosity, it leans forward in sympathy. However, there is a catch. It is always exactly one gesture behind. When you sit down, it is still standing for a heartbeat before it collapses into a chair. When you blink, it takes a fraction of a second to close its own ridged eyes. It is your shadow given weight and texture, trailing your every movement like a physical echo. Fifth, do not let the voice lead you too far. As the hours pass, the navigation becomes more frantic. The voice will start to describe roads that are impossibly complex. Take the winding path of sighs, it whispers. Cross the bridge of heavy breath. You find yourself walking through the station, your feet moving in a rhythmic dance. With every step you take, the mimic follows. It moves with a strange, fluid grace, its wicker-like skin creaking softly as it mimics your gait. You will begin to feel a sense of synchronization. Your heart beats, then its body pulses. You reach out to touch a wall. A moment later, its hand strikes the same wood. Sixth, maintain your focus on the present. The mimic is not just copying your shape, it is beginning to copy your intent. When you feel a surge of anxiety, the ridges on its face tighten. When you exhale a long breath of relief, its clay-like body seems to soften. It is learning the rhythm of your soul. Seventh, listen for the final destination. The voice will eventually reach a crescendo. The navigation will slow down, becoming rhythmic and deep. The road ends here, it will announce with a resonant hum. Reach out. At this moment, you must stop moving. You must stand perfectly still in the center of the room. Eighth, observe the mimic's final movement. As you freeze, the mimic will perform its final gesture. It is not a copy of your current stillness. Instead, it performs a move that you haven't made yet, a slow, deliberate reach toward your chest with both hands. Ninth, accept the connection. When the mimic's hands touch your ribs, the voice will fall silent. The station will feel as though it is shrinking, pulling inward toward that single point of contact. You will feel a strange warmth radiating from its clay skin into your own bones. Tenth, and most importantly, do not complete the final step. Once the mimic has finished reaching for you, it will perform the gesture you are about to make. It will lean forward and press its crescent mouth against yours to take a breath of your air. You must never let it finish that last movement, for if you do, you become the posture, and it becomes the one who moves. The second sibling. The salt air inside the bunker doesn't just smell of brine, it smells of old iron and wet limestone. I stood in the center of the main chamber, my flashlight beam cutting a yellow path through the dust. The walls were thick enough to muffle the roar of the Atlantic outside, leaving me with a silence so heavy it felt like pressure against my eardrums. Most people think abandoned bunkers are empty, but they aren't. They are full of the things that stayed behind when the soldiers left, the lingering echoes of footsteps, the microscopic debris of history, and the weight of 1,000 forgotten breaths. My job was simple: patrol the perimeter and check for structural cracks caused by the tide. It was a lonely shift, one I usually enjoyed until the first hum started. It wasn't a sound, exactly, more of a vibration in my molars, a low-frequency thrum that made the liquid in my inner ear dance. Then came the first chime from my pocket. My phone buzzed against my thigh, a sharp, modern intrusion into the ancient stillness. I pulled out the device, the screen glow casting a pale blue light on my palms. A notification appeared. New login from bedroom. I hadn't even set up an account for the bedroom yet, but there it was. In this bunker, miles from any modern house and devoid of furniture, a two-factor code arrived as if someone had just stepped into a room and turned on a light. The code blinked in the dimness. 4829. Who is home? I whispered, my voice sounding flat against the concrete. It seemed to be swallowed by the ceiling before it could echo. I felt a slight shift in the air temperature immediately following my words. It wasn't a draft, it was a localized cooling, like someone had just exhaled near my left ear, leaving behind a faint trail of frost that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Another chime followed immediately. New login from hallway. The code, 8102. I turned my light toward the shadows of the far corridor. For a second, I saw nothing but jagged rocks and debris, the harsh beam illuminating the textures of pitted stone. But then I noticed something on the floor. A small, damp patch of mud appeared where there hadn't been one before. It looked as though something heavy had just pressed down into the dust and then lifted away, leaving a perfect impression of a broad, rounded weight. I began to walk toward the source of the mud, my boots crunching on the grit. The atmosphere grew thick, smelling of crushed mint and old copper, a strange, organic pairing that felt deeply personal. Ping, new login from kitchen. Code 3371. The sounds were becoming more frequent, rhythmic like a heartbeat. They weren't just notifications anymore, they were pulses of activity. Every time a code appeared, the bunker felt smaller, as if the walls were leaning in to listen to what was happening in the invisible rooms. The pressure in my chest tightened. I stopped in the center of the main hall, holding my breath. The air seemed to shimmer, distorting the way the light hit the floor. Then, it began to manifest. In the center of the main hall, I saw it. It wasn't a ghost, and it wasn't a man. It was a crouched form, hunched over like a gargoyle made of woven wicker and wet velvet. It had no distinct face yet, just a collection of soft, overlapping folds that looked like a ruffled quilt. Its body was tucked tight, its limbs pulled in so close it looked like a lump of oversized moss sitting on the floor. Then it began to unfold. It didn't move with muscles or joints. It moved as if it were being remembered into existence by an invisible hand. It grew upward, stretching its limbs out like a blooming flower made of heavy fabric. The texture was porous and slightly iridescent, shifting from deep plum to a bruised mauve. It had no hair, but tiny, crystalline beads sprouted along its spine like frozen raindrops. It rose until it stood nearly 7 feet tall, its body swaying with a rhythmic, underwater grace. It didn't have a mouth or eyes in the traditional sense, just a series of deep, velvet-lined grooves that pulsed as it breathed. I realized then why the town always insisted I had a twin. They didn't mean a literal sibling born from my mother. They meant this thing, which lived in the periphery of my perception. It was the shadow of my own identity, finally taking shape. It reached out toward me, its woven texture shivering with anticipation. I stood frozen as it leaned in, its velvet folds fluttering against my cheek like a soft sigh. Ping, new login from your heart. I realized then that the bunker wasn't just a shell. It was its house, and now it was finally inviting me to sit down in its chair. The silhouette of the void. I was the last one to survive. The water of the quarry had claimed my team one by one, pulled into the limestone depths until only I remained on the shore. My oxygen tank felt heavy against my spine as I dragged myself out of the pool, the mud clinging to my skin like wet velvet. The sun was dipping below the jagged rim of the stone walls, casting long, violet shadows across the surface of the flooded basin. I collapsed onto a flat slab of rock and struck a match, lighting a small fire fueled by driftwood and scrub. The flames licked upward, carving out a circle of warmth in the cooling air. Beyond that golden ring, however, lay the vast, deepening gloom of the quarry floor. At first, I thought it was just the wind. A soft thrum echoed from the darkness, a vibration felt in my teeth rather than heard by my ears. "Who's there?" I whispered to the empty space. Nothing answered, but the fire flickered violently as if something had brushed past its warmth. I gripped my flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path through the haze. That was when I saw it, not a creature of flesh and bone, but a distortion in the world itself. Just beyond the reach of the campfire stood a shape. It was an exact replica of the space left behind by a person who had just stepped away. It wasn't a solid thing, it was a silhouette of absence. If you imagine a man standing there, but instead of a body, there is a hole in the air where a body should be, that is what this entity was. It lacked hair, skin, or texture. It was a three-dimensional cutout, perfectly defined by the surrounding environment. It moved with a rhythmic, deliberate pace. Asterisk thump. Pause. Thump. Asterisk every time it took a step closer to my fire, it felt like the world was trying to fill its outline. When it stood near a cluster of ferns, the ferns seemed to lean inward toward its invisible torso. It wasn't walking on the ground so much as it was carving a path through the reality of the quarry. I held my breath, terrified to move. The entity stopped just at the edge of the light. I could see the way the firelight curved around its edges, making the hole look like a shimmering ripple in a pond. It didn't have eyes or a mouth, yet it felt as though it were watching me with every inch of its hollow frame. "Are you hungry?" I asked, my voice trembling. The entity responded by shifting forward another foot. The crackle of the wood intensified. As it entered the inner circle of the fire, the colors of the flames seemed to bleed into its interior, revealing that it was a perfect vacuum. It didn't cast a shadow. Instead, it seemed to swallow the shadows around it. I felt a sudden, sharp chill. The temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant as the entity moved into my personal space. I could hear the sound of air rushing into its void, a low whoosh like a distant tide retreating from a beach. It was no longer just pacing, it was converging. I reached out my hand, my fingers trembling. I expected to feel fur or scales, but as my palm entered the space where the entity's chest should be, my hand didn't hit anything solid. Instead, it felt like plunging my arm into a pool of cool, still water that wasn't there. The sensation was haunting, a weightless pressure that pulled at my skin. Then, the pacing stopped completely. The entity stood directly in front of me, towering just slightly over my shoulder. I could feel its presence pressing against my chest, a physical vacuum demanding to be filled. It didn't have a face, but I realized it was mimicking my own posture, mirroring the way I leaned forward in awe. I closed my eyes, expecting it to vanish or strike. Instead, it began to expand. The boundaries of its shape started to blur, creeping outward toward my own body. It wasn't just a gap anymore. It was a hungry vacancy beginning to consume the scenery. I realized then that it wasn't just an entity shaped like a person who had walked away. It was the literal embodiment of what happens when something is gone. It surged forward, its edges overlapping with my own shoulders. I felt a strange tugging at my heart, as if the void were trying to pull my very atoms into its center. The fire died down to embers, and for a moment, we were two shapes in the dark, one of flesh and one of nothingness. Then, with a final, silent shudder, it reached out and took my place. It didn't move me. It simply occupied the space where I stood, turning my body into the very thing that had been pacing the quarry for hours. The wax impression. Scene 1. I am sitting in the chair now, facing the camera. If you're watching this, it means I survived what most people only hear about in hushed tones during late-night shifts. It started at 3:04 a.m. The hospital was nearly empty, that heavy, sterile silence that feels less like peace and more like a held breath. I had just entered the elevator to go from the ground floor to my ward. The door slid shut with a metallic sigh, and then the world lurched. A violent shudder shook the cabin, followed by a grinding groan of cable and pulley. We didn't just stop, we seized. We were suspended in the void between the 3rd and 4th floors, bathed in the sickly hum of emergency lights. Scene 2. The silence that followed was heavy. I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then came the sound, a wet, sliding noise from the corner of the ceiling. It wasn't the sound of something walking, it was the sound of something melting and hardening simultaneously. I looked up, expecting to see a maintenance shaft or a loose pipe. Instead, I saw a pool of amber-colored wax clinging to the corner of the ceiling like a sagging crown. It didn't just hang there. It pulsed. Scene 3. That's when I noticed it, the live stream. In the center of the elevator wall, right at eye level, a rectangular patch of space seemed to ripple. It wasn't a screen, yet it behaved like one. It was showing a view of me from an impossible perspective. From my point of view, I was looking straight ahead at the wax, but the screen showed me from behind, as if someone were standing 3 feet away, looking at the back of my head. But there was no one there. The angle was perfectly perpendicular to my own sight line. Scene 4. I reached out a trembling hand toward the ripple. As my fingers neared the screen, I saw a shape begin to emerge from the ceiling wax. It didn't drop down, it flowed. It was a mass of translucent, honey-colored wax that had solidified into a strange, bulbous form. It possessed no face, no limbs, just a body made of drips. However, as it moved, its surface rippled with the distinct textures of dozens of different hands. Scene 5. The entity began to descend. Every time it moved, it left behind the impression of a hand that had touched it long ago. I saw the jagged knuckles of an old man's grip, the soft pads of a child's palm, and the delicate, elegant curve of a pianist's fingers, all preserved in the wax like fossils in amber. It didn't have its own shape so much as it was a collection of every touch it had ever received. Scene 6, it reached my height and stopped. The live stream rippled violently. On that invisible screen, I saw what the entity saw, me looking at it with wide eyes, but also something else. Behind me, in the live stream view, a second set of hands began to reach out from the walls. They weren't part of the wax yet. They were shadows, moving toward my shoulders like silent observers. Scene 7, I spoke aloud for the first time, my voice cracking in the small space. "Who is watching?" The entity reacted instantly. It didn't speak, but it flowed forward, and suddenly, its body changed. The wax smoothed out, adopting the shape of a perfectly cupped palm, as if it were trying to catch something. Then it flattened into the shape of two hands pressed together in prayer. Scene 8, then came the terrifying realization. I looked at the live stream again. In that impossible angle, I could see that while I was looking at the wax was actually molding itself to match my own face. It wasn't just a shape, it was recording me. The surface of the amber mass began to show the distinct texture of my own thumbprint, repeating over and over like a rhythmic heartbeat. Scene 9, the elevator gave another shudder. The wax surged forward, finally making contact with my chest. It felt warm, not hot, but comfortably temperate. As it touched me, the live stream flickered. For 1 second, the perspective shifted again. I saw myself from the front, but in that same frame, the wax was no longer just a mass. It had formed into a hand reaching out to cover my mouth, its surface showing the unmistakable marks of my own terrified grip. Scene 10, the elevator groaned and began to move upward, finally reaching the 4th floor. The doors slid open with a soft click. The wax stayed on my chest for a moment before sliding off onto the floor, where it hardened into a perfect, permanent impression of my face, eyes wide, mouth slightly open in a silent "oh." I stepped out into the hallway, but as I turned back to look at the elevator one last time, I saw that the live stream was still active on the back wall, showing me standing in the hall, even though there was no longer anyone inside the cabin. The logistics of the infinite descent. Log entry 1. The sleeper train hums with a steady, rhythmic pulse. I am tucked into my berth, the velvet curtains drawn tight against the ink of the countryside. Outside, the land is a void. Inside, it is a sanctuary of warm wood and the smell of old upholstery, a comforting mixture of beeswax, dust, and aged leather. The carriage feels intimate, a cocoon on wheels where the ticking of the clock is synchronized with my own heartbeat. It is peaceful. Log entry 2. The rocking has begun. It isn't just the movement of the heavy iron wheels against the track. It feels as though the train itself is swaying in a dream, tilting at angles that defy the laws of physics. I watched a single snowflake hang in the air for 3 seconds before melting, suspended by an invisible thread of gravity. Time feels thick now, like syrup pouring from a jar, stretching every second into a lingering moment of contemplation. Log entry 3. A voice began tonight. It doesn't come from the conductor's whistle or the low moan of the steam engine. Instead, it emanates from the very rafters of the carriage, vibrating through the ceiling and settling into my bones. It is smooth, melodic, and utterly devoid of human breath, a sound like silver bells ringing underwater. "Take the first turn to the left," it whispered. There are no turns visible in the dark, but I felt the train lean with a sudden, purposeful grace into an invisible curve, as if carving its path through a sea of shadows. Log entry 4. The voice spoke again while I was drifting toward sleep, my head resting against the plush cushion. "Proceed to the secondary junction." It sounded satisfied, almost expectant. I realized then that there is no destination on the timetable. The numbers have been scrubbed away by some unseen hand. The village we passed at dusk, a cluster of thatched roofs and flickering lanterns, has disappeared entirely from my memory. In its place is a road of crushed amethyst and silver glass that seems to stretch forever, sparkling like a frozen river under a moonless sky. Log entry 5. Fatigue is setting in. My eyelids feel heavy, weighted down by invisible lead weights. To shake them off, I decided to leave my berth and walk toward the galley. There is a staircase there, a winding wooden structure leading down into the belly of the train, its railings polished to a dull sheen. The air here is cooler, smelling of damp earth and distant rain. I started to climb it. 1, 2, 3. Log entry 6. I stopped counting at 4. My eyes fluttered shut for a heartbeat, just one pulse of heavy sleep, as if my brain were trying to snag a moment of rest. When I opened them again, I realized there was an extra step between 3 and 5. It hadn't been there before. It had materialized from the gloom like a growing limb. The wood felt warmer than the others, almost pulsing with a faint heat. Keep going, the voice murmured from the shadows above. /log entry 7. I climbed higher, my breath hitching in the quiet air. Every time my eyelids dipped, every time I surrendered to a microsecond of exhaustion, a new step materialized out of the gloom. 1, 2, 3, 4, and another appeared beneath my foot. 5, and another. The staircase is growing as I fail to stay awake, expanding its length in direct proportion to my weariness. It is no longer just a path, it is a living thing that feeds on my tiredness. Log entry 8. The navigation voice began to pulse with a slight vibration, like the purring of a large cat nearby. Recalculate for the orchard of size, it commanded. I looked out the window and saw trees with leaves shaped like human ears, bowing in a wind that wasn't there, as if listening to my very thoughts. I tried to count the steps again, but my exhaustion was deep now, pulling at my muscles. The staircase felt endless, a vertical labyrinth where the end was always just one blink away. Log entry 9. I am halfway down the stairs now, or perhaps I am still at the top. It is hard to tell when the ground keeps adding itself beneath. My feet with every heartbeat. Each time I blink, the wood groans and a new tread appears, carving its way into existence from the void. The air is becoming denser here, tasting of salt and ancient paper. The destination is nearing, the voice sang. It sounds less like a guide now and more like an invitation, a beckoning call from something waiting in the deep. /log entry 10. I finally reached the bottom, but there was no floor, only a vast, flat plain of white sand that stretched out toward an unseen horizon. The train is gone. The stairs are gone. Only the voice remains, hovering just above my ear like a physical weight. It didn't say, "Welcome." Instead, it whispered with a terrifying clarity, "You may now begin your walk." I looked up to see the staircase, still growing behind me, stretching toward a ceiling that has no roof. The Upward Overflow. Scene 1. My grandfather's family Bible was a heavy, leather-bound relic that lived on the mantel of our farmhouse. It wasn't just a collection of scripture, it was a record of our survival. In the flyleaf, the birth dates were neat and orderly, but by the time I reached the bottom of the page, the death dates had crowded out the births entirely, overflowing into messy clusters of ink that seemed to bleed into the margins. It felt as if the dead were slowly claiming more territory than the living. One rainy Tuesday, while tracing a particularly dense cluster of dates, a new line appeared in fresh, wet ink, "The Great Spill." Final night. Below it, my grandfather had scribbled a single instruction: watch the mill. Scene 2. That evening, I stood alone in the old feed mill on the edge of our property. It was its final night of operation before the gears would be locked forever. The air inside smelled of toasted grain and ancient dust. The massive wooden chutes and iron grinding stones sat silent, like sleeping giants waiting for a command that would never come. I sat on a crate in the center of the main floor, watching the way the moonlight cut through the rafters, illuminating the suspended dust motes. Scene 3. As the clock struck midnight, the silence changed. It didn't become quieter, it became heavier. A low hum began to vibrate in my teeth, a frequency felt rather than heard. The shadows of the machinery seemed to stretch toward me, reaching out like velvet hands. Then I saw the first movement on the eastern wall. It wasn't a creature, not yet. It was a smudge of deep, indigo ink, a spill of dark that didn't just sit on the surface. It began to move, defying gravity. Scene 4. The spill moved like water falling upward from a puddle at the base of the wall. It didn't pool on the floor, it climbed. It was a thick, viscous substance with the texture of velvet and oil. It rippled as it ascended, pulling the dust with it, creating tiny whirlpools in the air. As it moved, it made a sound like silk being dragged over sandpaper, a constant, rhythmic hiss that filled the rafters. Scene 5. I stood up, my breath hitching. The spill was growing. It wasn't just moving upward, it was expanding outward, spreading across the timber beams like a slow-motion tide. It moved with a deliberate, pulsing intent. Every few seconds, a bubble of darkness would swell and pop, releasing a faint scent of ozone and wet earth. It looked as though the very wall were secreting a shadow that wanted to escape its boundaries. Scene 6. By 2 in the morning, I realized the scale of the thing. I had assumed it was a small puddle, but it was massive, so large that it took up the entire height of the mill. It wasn't just on the wall. It began to wrap around the pillars and slide over the grinding stones. It moved with a liquid grace, flowing over the jagged edges of the iron machinery like honey pouring over a mountain range. I felt small, a tiny speck of warmth in a sea of rising gloom. Scene 7. I stepped toward the eastern wall, reaching out a hand to touch it. The surface was cool and slightly tacky. When my fingers dipped into the spill, it didn't just sit there. It rippled outward from my touch, sending a wave of darkness toward the ceiling. It felt dense, as if I were touching heavy liquid, but it resisted my movement, pulling back gently like a shy creature reluctant to be disturbed. Scene 8. As the hours bled into one another, the spill reached its peak velocity. It began to churn, swirling in great, slow orbits. It was no longer just climbing, it was flowing across the ceiling now, pouring over the rafters and dripping downward like a rain of shadows. The entire mill became a vessel for this upward-falling tide. I sat on the floor, my head tilted back, watching as the dark substance eventually covered every inch of the timber and stone. Scene 9. Then, the movement slowed. The hiss faded into a deep, resonant thrum that made the ground beneath me tremble. The spill began to settle, thickening until it was almost solid, clinging to the walls like moss on an ancient tree. It had traveled its path across the mill, stretching from the floor to the highest peak of the roof, perfectly coating every surface in a layer of deep, textured midnight. Scene 10. The sun began to peek over the horizon, turning the indigo spill into a dull charcoal. The mill was still, and I stood up, brushing the dust from my knees. The feed mill was finally finished, its purpose fulfilled for the last time. As I walked toward the exit, I noticed a single drop of the dark substance had fallen onto the floor right in front of me. It hadn't dried into a puddle. It was still pulsing slowly, like a heartbeat, and as I stepped past it, I felt a tiny, wet sensation on my cheek, as if something from the wall had reached out just to taste the air. The stuttering guest of Reservoir 9. It is 2 a.m. The concrete walls of the control room are sweating, weeping beads of moisture that catch the harsh, flickering light of the overhead bulbs. Beneath my boots, the floor vibrates with a constant, subterranean pulse. The hum of the turbines deep within the dam's belly feels like a steady, mechanical heartbeat. I am alone in this bunker, a solitary sentinel surrounded by ticking clocks and glowing dials that track the lifeblood of Reservoir 9. Every time I look at the heavy steel door leading back to the corridor, it feels as though it is waiting for something. It isn't just an opening, it feels like a mouth held slightly agape. I just saw it, or rather, I saw its outline. When I stepped into the room from the hallway, a shadow was standing in the doorway, not a flickering silhouette cast by a candle, but a solid, ink-stained shape that seemed to have weight and substance. It stood perfectly still as I entered, rooted like an ancient tree. And then, the moment my foot crossed the threshold, it vanished into the wall behind me, as if the room had swallowed it whole. I am sitting at the console now, trying to force my focus onto the pressure gauges and the steady crawl of the needles. Every time I glance back at that doorway, there is nothing but empty space, yet the air feels heavy, thick with a sudden humidity. It's as if the shadow left a residue of coldness in the room, a lingering frost that refuses to dissipate. I can hear a sound, a soft, rhythmic clicking, like a needle hitting a groove in a record, coming from just beyond the frame of the door. It is a lonely, persistent noise that seems to pull at my attention. The clicking has changed. It's no longer mechanical. It sounds like a wet, muffled thud, as if something soft were falling onto moss every few seconds. And there she is again. She didn't walk in this time. She simply appeared, as if the universe had decided to slot her into existence. She is standing in the doorway, her body composed of deep indigo hues that seem to ripple like oil on water. She doesn't have a face in the traditional sense. Her head is a smooth dome of textured velvet, and her torso is elongated, swaying slightly as if caught in an underwater current. She is moving now, but it isn't a fluid motion. It's a stutter. She moves like a film reel with a broken frame. 1 second she is 3 feet back, the next she is 2 feet forward, skipping the space in between with a jarring, ghostly grace. She looks like a signal trying to reach a receiver through a storm, struggling against the very fabric of time to find her place. I try to speak to her, my voice cracking in the vastness of the bunker. I whispered, "Who are you?" and she responded with a sound that made my skin prickle. It wasn't a human voice, it was the sound of a clock winding up, followed by a sharp intake of breath that echoed off the sweating concrete. She moved again, stuttering forward until her chest almost touched the threshold of the room, each jump accompanied by a faint ripple in the air. She is closer now. Her body is shimmering with an internal light. The indigo surface of her skin has tiny, raised beads that glow with a faint amber light. They look like pores on an orange, but they pulse in time with the dam's vibrations, glowing brighter as the turbines groan below. She doesn't have feet. Her lower body tapers into a heavy, weighted tail that drags slightly on the concrete floor, leaving no trail behind it. I stood up to walk toward her, my heart hammering against my ribs. But she stuttered backward just as I reached out, retreating with a sudden, panicked fluidity. She seems to exist in a state of constant hesitation. It's as if she wants to enter the room completely, but is terrified of losing the doorway that holds her, as if the door were a safety net she isn't quite ready to let go of. Her velvet head rotated, not smoothly, but in 3 distinct jerks, toward my face. The humming of the turbines has reached a crescendo, the vibration shaking. The very dust from the ceiling. The shadow woman is now vibrating so fast she looks blurred at the edges, her indigo body turning into a smear of deep blue and amber light. She is no longer just an observer. She is leaning into my space, defying the laws of distance. I can feel the temperature drop by 10 degrees every time she skips forward, a sudden chill that steals the breath from my lungs. She finally took the last stuttering step. She didn't walk through the door. She simply occupied the same space as the air around me. Her velvet head pressed against mine, and for a moment, I felt her thoughts, a chaotic jumble of static and echoes, like memories from a dream I haven't had yet. Then, she gave one final, violent twitch and vanished into my own shadow, leaving the doorway perfectly, terrifyingly empty. It is 2 a.m. The concrete walls of the control room are sweating. The resident of the root cellar. I took a wrong turn on the county road and found myself pulling into the gravel lot of the old Miller estate. It was a foreclosed farmhouse, sagging under the weight of overgrown ivy. When I stepped inside, the air felt thick, like it had been holding its breath for 40 years. In the center of the kitchen sat a single, plush velvet couch, looking absurdly luxurious against the peeling wallpaper. I sat down to rest my legs, and as I did, something peculiar happened. The cushion didn't just sink, it yielded with a soft, rhythmic hum, like a deep inhale. When I stood up, the indentation stayed, a perfect bowl of shadow where my weight had been. It was cozy enough that I decided to stay for an hour. I'm the one who bought it on a whim. I live in a city apartment now, but the farmhouse couch is my prized possession. One evening, after moving it into my living room, I sat in it and watched the way it behaved. When I rose to fetch a glass of water, I expected the cushion to slowly flatten back out over time. Instead, as soon as I left the room, it surged upward. It didn't just return to its original shape. It filled with a pressurized plumpness that made the velvet ripple like a pawn struck by a pebble. I noticed something else on the second night. When I sat in the cushion, I felt a slight pressure against my lower back, not from the fabric, but as if something were pushing against me from beneath the surface. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. I touched the velvet and felt a vibration. It felt less like furniture and more like a lung expanding and contracting in the dark. By the third night, the humming became audible. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was a low, vibrating thrum that seemed to resonate in my teeth. I sat down and felt the cushion mold to my spine with aggressive precision. It felt as though it were memorizing me. When I stood up, the cushion didn't just refill, it shuddered. A small puff of dust escaped from the seams, and for a split second, the velvet seemed to ripple as if something inside was adjusting its position. I decided to move the couch into the root cellar of my backyard garden, where it could sit in the cool dampness. I wanted to see if the subterranean atmosphere would change its behavior. It did. In the cellar, the hum grew deeper, becoming a rhythmic pulse that echoed off the stone walls. The cushion began to refill faster. Every time I stepped away, the velvet bloomed outward with such force that it occasionally brushed against my knees as I walked past. On the seventh night, I was sitting in the cellar, reading by candlelight, when the cushion finally spoke. Or rather, it exhaled. A soft, warm breath of air escaped from beneath me, smelling faintly of old parchment and crushed violets. Then a movement occurred. While I sat perfectly still, the cushion surged upward toward my chest. It wasn't just filling its dent, it was reaching for me. I froze. A shape began to emerge from the center of the velvet. It didn't come out all at once. First, a series of textures appeared, bits of woolly fuzz and smooth, polished bark. Then, a face started to form in the middle of the cushion. It was a strange, shifting thing. It had 3 nostrils arranged in a triangle and eyes that looked like hammered copper coins. Its mouth was a jagged slit filled with tiny, pearl-like teeth. The entity climbed out of the cushion entirely, though it remained connected to the base by a cluster of translucent threads. It was built from every detail I had ever forgotten about faces in my own life. It had a chin that resembled a cracked river stone and ears that were shaped like curled maple leaves. Its hair wasn't hair at all. It was a crown of stiff, iridescent bristles that shimmered in the candlelight. It moved with a jerky, stop-motion grace, its body swaying as if it were trying to remember how to stand. I reached out my hand, and the creature, the memory face, approached. It didn't have a steady shape. It flickered slightly, like a flame in a draft. As I touched its cheek, the texture changed from rough bark to soft moss instantly. It opened its mouth and made a sound like 2 pieces of dry wood clicking together. The next morning, I went down to the cellar to find the couch. The velvet was flat, perfectly smooth and silent. No entity, no threads. But when I sat down, my heart skipped a beat. The cushion didn't just hold my weight, it surged upward instantly, filling its dent with such violence that it threw me backward. As I looked at the empty velvet surface, I realized the entity wasn't gone. It was simply waiting for the next time I moved, ready to become the very shape of my own forgotten thoughts. I reached down to touch the cushion again, and felt a tiny, mossy finger poke back from beneath the fabric. I took a wrong turn on the county road and found myself pulling into the gravel lot of the old Miller estate. The precursor of the tide. To whoever takes over the watch after me, do not be startled by the silence. People think the sea stacks are quiet, but they aren't. They are heavy with sound that most people ignore until it starts to bite at them. I am handing over the lighthouse duties for the 3rd night of the lunar cycle, and because of what happened tonight, you need to know how to handle the hum. It began at dusk. When the tide started rushing into the basin, cutting the stack off from the mainland, a vibration crawled into my inner ear. It wasn't a sound you could hear with your ears as much as it was a pressure in your skull. At first, it was just a low drone, like a distant hive of bees. But by midnight, the frequency sharpened. It began to shape itself into syllables. Elias, it whispered in my mind. It wasn't a voice speaking out loud. It was the vibration carving your name out of the air. It felt like being submerged in warm honey. The hum grew louder with every passing hour, vibrating the marrow in my bones. By 2 a.m., the hum was no longer just constant, it was hungry. That is when I saw him. He emerged from the western cave, a figure composed of heavy velvet textures and brass accents. He stood nearly 7 feet tall, wearing a coat that looked like woven seawater, shimmering with deep teals and copper threads. His face was broad and smooth, lacking a traditional nose or ears, replaced instead by a series of decorative gold rivets along his jawline. Most strikingly, he didn't have eyes. He had 3 glowing amber spheres embedded in his forehead like pearls. But the most unsettling thing about him was his shadow. The man moved with a deliberate, rhythmic grace, but his shadow was impatient. It didn't follow him. It led him. Every time the man took a step forward, his shadow had already landed on the stone floor a full second before his feet touched it. It was as if the shadow were a scout, claiming the ground before the body arrived to occupy it. At first, I thought he was a ghost of the tide. I sat by the hearth and watched him pace the perimeter of the lighthouse gallery. He didn't walk so much as glide, his heavy coat swaying like seaweed in a current. "Who are you?" I asked aloud. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he moved toward me. His shadow leaped across the floor, stretching out toward my chair before he even lifted his foot. The hum in my head spiked in volume, turning into a frantic, pulsing thrum. By 4 a.m., the hum began to change again. It stopped repeating my name and started mimicking the sounds of the lighthouse itself, the groan of the timber, the whistle of the wind, but it played them back in reverse. The shadow was becoming more erratic now, dancing across the walls with a mind of its own while the man remained perfectly still. I realized then that he wasn't just walking, he was reacting to my movements. When I reached out a hand, his shadow would reach out first, touching my fingertips a moment before his physical hand followed. He was chasing his own silhouette. As the tide began to turn and the moon hit its zenith, the hum reached a deafening crescendo. It wasn't just Elias anymore. It was Elias. 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 Layered over itself like a choir of 1,000 versions of me speaking at once. He stopped exactly 3 paces from me. He didn't have a mouth, yet I felt the hum intensify until it felt like he was exhaling my name into my very chest. His shadow suddenly flattened against his body, losing its independence for 1 heartbeat, before exploding outward to cover every inch of the floor. He leaned down, his forehead spheres glowing with a fierce, golden intensity. He didn't touch me, but I felt the air around us grow heavy and cold. The hum settled into a final, singular note that resonated in my teeth. Then he did something impossible. He took 1 final step forward. His shadow hit the ground first, then his body landed on top of it with a soft, wet thud. But as he moved, the shadow didn't just stay under him. It began to bleed outward, creeping toward my feet. Like spilled ink, I stood up and retreated into the lantern room, seeking safety in the height. He followed, his coat rustling like dry parchment. The hum died down to a whisper, but it didn't disappear. It stayed, lingering in the corners of the room, waiting for me to move. He has now settled into the corner behind the main lens. He doesn't move much anymore. He simply waits there, watching me with those 3 amber spheres. I can sleep now because he is content to stay in his spot, but I know that as long as he is here, my shadow is no longer entirely mine. Every time I move, it feels as though something is pulling it toward him from the corner. The worst part is what happened just before I sat down to write this. He looked at me one last time and let out a tiny, melodic hum that sounded exactly like a sigh of relief. Then his shadow reached out and gripped my own ankle, holding it steady so I wouldn't have to move. The receipt of the reacher. I moved into this apartment 3 weeks ago, and I didn't notice the hatch until my laundry pile started smelling like damp earth. It's tucked away in the back of the bedroom closet, a small, rectangular wooden square with a brass handle. At first, it was just a curiosity. But on the 4th night, I heard a rhythmic scraping coming from beneath the floorboards. I opened the hatch and looked down into the crawl space. It wasn't empty. There was something white and textured lying there, looking like a half-finished roll of parchment. It began with a light. When I turned on my bedside lamp, it stayed bright for exactly 3 seconds before the glow seemed to be pulled toward the closet. Not just dimmed, it felt as though the photons were being inhaled by the hatch. I climbed down into the crawl space using a small step stool. The air was cooler here, smelling of old paper and static electricity. In the center of the dust sat the entity. It didn't have a face in the way we do. It looked like a continuous ribbon of textured vellum unspooling from a central knot. Every few seconds, a new line of body would print itself out from its core. It was a physical manifestation of data. As it printed, the texture changed. 1 inch might be rough and woven like burlap, the next smooth as silk, the next ridged like a topographic map. It grew toward me, extending an additional inch of existence every time I blinked. I watched as a new section emerged. This part was thick and covered in tiny, raised bumps that felt like braille. How much further? I whispered to the dusty floor. The entity didn't speak, but it reacted to my voice. A sudden surge of printing occurred. It unspooled with a dry hiss, 3 inches of intricate lacework texture erupting from its center in a heartbeat. It started to move toward me, not by walking, but by flowing like a liquid ribbon. I realized then that the streetlights outside my window were behaving strangely too. Every time I took a step toward the closet, the light directly in front of my toes vanished, while the lights behind me remained bright. It was as if the entity was consuming the distance ahead of it. By the second week, the printing became constant. The crawl space was no longer just a storage area. It was a factory of becoming. The entity grew until it filled the entire horizontal span of the space. It wasn't just paper anymore. It was a physical landscape. I sat in the middle of the crawl space, watching the front of the ribbon. It began to develop features, not eyes or ears, but geometric protrusions. 1 inch would be a cluster of crystalline spikes, the next a soft, velvet fold. It was building itself out of the sheer fact of its existence. One night, I noticed something terrifying about the way it grew. The entity wasn't just printing outward, it was printing inward. The parts it had already printed began to ripple. They weren't static. The lacework sections started to pulse like a heartbeat. I reached out to touch it, and my hand felt the texture of 1,000 different worlds. It felt like touching wet sand, then smooth marble, then the underside of a moth's wing. As I touched it, the printing accelerated. The entity began to scream, not with a voice, but with a sound like 1,000 pages being turned at once. It was growing faster now. It wasn't just taking up space, it was devouring the room. The walls of the crawl space seemed to be shrinking as the ribbon expanded. I realized that every time I moved my hand, the entity printed more to meet my touch. It was becoming a record of everything I did within its reach. It captured my movement and turned it into texture. Backslash on the 10th night, the printing became violent. The ribbon began to whip around like a serpent, each inch revealing a new complexity. Some parts were serrated like saws, others were porous like sponge. It reached my chest. I could feel the heat radiating from its surface. I closed my eyes and felt it print against my ribs. It felt like a tiny forest of needles growing over my skin. Then, the printing stopped. Silence fell over the crawl space. The entity sat still, a massive, complex tapestry of textures spanning from corner to corner. I crawled out of the hatch and stood in my bedroom. I looked at the closet door. The light in the room was dim, as if the walls themselves were being fed into the ribbon. I realized then that it wasn't just printing itself. It was printing me. I looked down at my own arm where it had touched the entity and saw a new texture emerging from my skin, a tiny, perfect row of velvet ridges. The hatch was still open. In the center of the room, I heard a faint, wet sound. I looked back into the crawl space and saw that the ribbon had finally reached the very edge of the wood. It didn't just stop at the exit. It began to print out into the bedroom air, claiming the floorboards as its next canvas. Every time I breathed, a new inch of texture appeared on my collarbone, turning my flesh into the same patterned parchment as the beast. I reached for the handle, but my fingers were no longer skin, they were grain. The hatch was waiting, and beneath it, the damp earth began to rise. The Knuckle-Walker of Peak 9. Listen closely, for my breath is short now. The air in this room feels heavy, but the memory of that mountain remains sharp as a winter frost. It was the Great Blizzard of '84, the one they still call the White Silence. I was stationed at listening post 9, a lonely spire of timber and iron perched so high that the clouds felt like solid walls of wool against my face. Our job was simple: catch the stray whispers of the valley below. We intercepted static, Morse code from stranded hikers, and the occasional groan of shifting ice. But on the third night, the radio didn't just catch sound, it caught a rhythm. It started as a rhythmic thrumming through the speakers. Not wind, not thunder. It was steady, like a heartbeat made of wood hitting stone. Do you hear that? I whispered to my partner, Elias. He nodded, his breath blooming in white plumes. We both sat mesmerized by the static until it broke into a sequence of wet, heavy thuds. Asterisk, thumb click. Thumb click, asterisk. It sounded like something was walking outside, but not with feet. Then we saw him. Out past the perimeter fence, amidst the swirling white powder, stood a figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a boulder or a jagged shard of ice. But as the wind died down for a heartbeat, the shape resolved into a man. He stood in the middle of the clearing, perfectly upright. He's exactly 40 steps away, Elias remarked, his voice trembling. We counted. 40 paces from the porch railing to where he stood. He wasn't moving. He was just there. He looked like a traveler in a heavy, velvet tunic the color of bruised plums. But it was his face that unsettled us. It lacked a nose or ears. Instead, it had a wide, lipless mouth and 3 vertical slits where eyes should be. Then came the movement. The man took 1 step forward. I gasped. He didn't walk like we do. His limbs were long, but his hands were massive, huge, fleshy paddles that looked like they belonged to a prehistoric beast. And yet, he walked on his knuckles. Each time he moved, those oversized knuckles struck the ground with a meaty whump, and his palms slid forward in a gliding motion. Stay still, I commanded. He took another step. He was now 39 steps away. Every time he moved, the distance closed by exactly 1 step. He never hurried. He never lingered. He simply migrated toward us with a methodical, grinding grace. His knuckles were textured like rough bark, and when they hit the snow, they didn't just sink, they pushed outward in a ripple of powder. By the second hour, he was 30 steps away. The wind began to howl again, but we could still see him clearly through the veil. He moved with a strange, swaying motion, his torso leaning forward as if gravity were trying to pull him into the earth. Is he coming for us? Elias asked, clutching his clipboard until his knuckles turned white. He's just reaching, I replied. But as he reached 20 steps, the sound changed. The thumb click became a wet, suctioning noise. Each time those massive knuckles hit the ground, they seemed to grip the frost, pulling the very air toward them. The silence of the mountain felt heavier now, pressing against our eardrums like deep water. When he reached 10 steps, I could see his hands clearly. They were not just large, they were heavy enough that his wrists bent slightly under their weight. He didn't have thumbs in the way we do. Instead, he had 2 small, nub-like protrusions on the side of each palm. He's almost here, I whispered. My heart was a frantic drum in my chest. At 5 steps, the smell hit us. It wasn't a foul stench, but rather the scent of whetstone and crushed pine needles. The man raised his hands, bringing them up to his face. He didn't have fingers to grasp with. He simply pressed his enormous knuckles against his lipless mouth. Why won't he just reach out? Elias cried out as the figure was now only 3 steps away. He moved 1 more time. 2 steps remaining. He didn't reach for our hands. He didn't bow. He simply hovered there, his head tilted slightly toward us. The vertical slits of his eyes seemed to pulse with a faint, inner glow, like embers buried in ash. Then he moved the final 2 steps. He was standing right before us. His massive knuckles were level with our chests. He didn't have a face to smile with, so he simply opened his wide mouth and let out a sound, not a word, but a long, vibrating hum that shook the floorboards of the porch. Backslash, backslash, and then he did the only thing that made sense. He didn't grab us. He didn't speak. He simply leaned forward until his heaviest knuckle pressed against my forehead, and for 1 second, I felt his mind a vast, lonely ocean of cold water. Backslash, then he retreated. He didn't walk back. He simply vanished into the white, leaving nothing but a single deep indentation in the snow where he had stood. We were alone again. The radio hummed with static, and the wind returned to its morning song. But as I lay on my deathbed now, I realized the true terror of that night. He didn't come to see us. He came to measure us. And as I look at the empty space in front of me, I know that tonight, when the lights go out and the world is still, he will be exactly 40 steps away again, waiting for his turn to count down. The Borrowed Stature of Ward 7. Night Watchman's Log. Winter, 1918. The influenza has claimed the town, but it has claimed my sanity as well. Scene 1. Entry into the ward. I have been assigned to the quarantine ward for 3 weeks. It is a hollow shell of stone and wood, smelling of eucalyptus and damp wool. The air here feels thick, as if the breath of 100 sleeping souls has settled like dust upon the rafters. The patients are mostly still, their breathing heavy and rhythmic, a low, oceanic thrum that vibrates in my chest with every step I take. My job is simple: walk the perimeter, ensure the lanterns stay lit, and keep the silence from becoming too heavy. But tonight, the silence feels different. It is not an absence of sound. It is a presence waiting to be filled. Scene 2. The First Sighting. At midnight, I reached Ward 7. That is where it first appeared. The lantern light flickered against the lime-washed walls, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to stretch toward me like reaching fingers. It wasn't a patient, but something standing by the far cot. It had no shape of its own yet, an ambiguity of form that made my skin prickle. It stood perfectly upright, imitating the rigid posture of an old man sitting in a chair nearby. Its skin looked like weathered parchment, crinkled and dry, and its hair was a thicket of copper wires that caught the amber glow of the flame. Scene 3. The First Observation. I paused my lantern, the light pooling on the floorboards at my feet. "Who goes there?" I whispered, my voice cracking in the cavernous room. The figure didn't move at first, a statue of stolen dignity. Then it shifted. It lost the old man's rigidity and suddenly slumped into a slouch that belonged to a tired weaver, shoulders rounded, head tilted slightly forward as if bearing an invisible weight. It moved with a fluid, boneless grace, like a garment being tried on by an invisible wearer, shifting its weight with a soft, dry rustle of parchment. Scene 4. The Mimicry of Movement. By 1 a.m., I found it near the window, where the moonlight filtered through the grime. It had adopted the posture of a child reaching for a fallen fruit, one arm extended, the body leaning forward at a sharp angle, its center of gravity perfectly balanced. Its face was strange. It lacked distinct features until it moved. When it shifted again, its jaw dropped open in a perfect imitation of a gasping soldier, capturing that split second of inhaled air and wide-eyed shock. Scene 5. The Growing Awareness. It began to follow me. Every time I turned my head, it was there, occupying the space just behind my shoulder like a silent shadow. It didn't walk so much as it drifted into my personal orbit. It would steal my own posture for a moment, shoulders hunched, chin tucked against the cold, and then instantly snap into something else, like a bowing courtier or a stretching feline. I felt its presence like a magnetic pull, a constant companion that was neither quite there nor completely gone. Scene 6. The Change in Color. This is what began to unsettle me most. As I watched it borrow these shapes, its eyes changed in ways the body did not. They weren't just colors, they were memories of hues. It borrowed the posture of a weeping woman, her spine curved and head bowed, and its eyes turned a deep, bruised violet, the color of a storm-heavy sky. Then, as it took on the stance of a proud king, chest puffed out and chin held high, they flared into a brilliant, burning gold, like embers in a dying hearth. Scene 7. The Recognition. I realized the horror of its existence. It has no permanent identity. It is a thief of form, a scavenger of motion. It steals the way we hold ourselves and wears those poses like clothes, finding beauty in our fleeting gestures. Are you seeking your own shape? I asked it at 3 a.m., my voice barely a breath in the freezing air. It responded by taking on the posture of an exhausted traveler, its body leaning heavily to one side as if supporting a heavy pack across many miles. Scene 8. the escalation. By 4 o'clock. The ward felt crowded. Even though only one entity was there, it seemed to fill the room with every posture it had stolen that night. It moved from a curled fetal position to an upright march in seconds, its body flickering through transitions like a film strip of human motion. Its skin began to ripple like water as it transitioned between shapes, the parchment texture rippling and smoothing out with every new borrowed life. Scene 9, the final shift. Just before dawn, I stood perfectly still at the center of the ward, my own heart hammering against my ribs. The entity approached me with a slow, deliberate intent. It didn't just take my posture, it took my entire stillness. It became a statue of me, mirroring my upright stance and the slight tilt of my head. Yet its eyes remained the most startling thing about it. They were no longer gold or violet. They had turned the exact shade of amber I saw in my mother's old pocket watch. Scene 10, the resolution. I reached out to touch its shoulder, but as my hand made contact, the entity collapsed into a heap of loose fabric, finally settling into a neutral, resting pose it had never used before. It sat on the floor, perfectly still, looking up at me with those amber eyes. It has finally found a shape to hold onto for just 1 minute. As I turned to leave, I noticed it was no longer mimicking anything. It was simply waiting for the next person to give it something new to wear. The translation of the last corridor. Translator's note: the following passage was originally written in a forgotten dialect of the High Valleys. I have attempted to translate it into English, but as the author noted in the margins, certain nuances, particularly regarding the sensory experience of absence, refuse to settle perfectly into our tongue. Please forgive any slight loss of atmosphere during the conversion. It began on a Tuesday, though the day felt elongated, stretched thin like a piece of taffy pulled until it nearly snapped. I was driving my old sedan through the outskirts of the town when the rain started, not a downpour, but a persistent, rhythmic tapping that made the world feel insulated. I pulled into the Velvet Wash, a car wash tunnel that felt strangely oversized for its modest size. It was nearly empty, save for a single set of headlights flickering in the distance. I drove inside. The heavy gates groaned shut behind me with a sound like a closing book. Then the water started. It wasn't just water. It was a thick, amber-hued liquid that smelled of ozone and old cedar wood. I shifted into neutral, letting the brushes move over my hood. At first, it was satisfying, the rhythmic scrubbing, the muffled hum of the machinery. But then, the brushes slowed. They didn't stop completely, but they began to hesitate, as if they were trying to remember what happened next. I moved forward an inch, and the water became still. The humming dropped into a low, vibrating drone that I felt in my teeth rather than heard in my ears. It was then that I noticed the doorway-shaped absence. It appeared at the far end of the tunnel. It wasn't a physical object, but a rupture in the architecture, a rectangle of not there, where the hallway simply forgot to keep going. Imagine a corridor that reaches for the next room, but decides, halfway through, that there is no need to continue. The edges of this absence were jagged, like torn paper, and within it sat a vertical void. It didn't have depth so much as it had a texture. It looked like velvet made of shadows, pulsing with a slow, rhythmic expansion. I tried to accelerate, but the car felt heavy, as if moving through honey. The brushes began to move again, but they were no longer scrubbing. They were reaching out toward the absence, their bristles twitching like the hairs on the back of a neck. And then I heard it. A sound from within the void. "Is it time yet?" a voice whispered. It wasn't a human voice. It sounded like two pieces of sandpaper rubbing together softly. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. The car lurched forward, and I found myself entering the absence. It didn't feel like driving into a room. It felt like being swallowed by a thought. The walls of the tunnel disappeared, replaced by a sense of infinite almost. Everything was suspended in that moment of transition. That is when she appeared. She emerged from the center of the void, walking toward my windshield. She wasn't a ghost or a phantom. She was a physical presence made of geometry and memory. She looked like my mother, but her proportions were slightly off, her arms were just a fraction too long, and her skin had the texture of smooth river stones. But it was her face that stopped my breath. She wore the smile your mother only learned after the accident. Before the crash, her mouth was usually a line of stoic contentment. After the accident, the night the car spun into the ravine and she spent 3 weeks in the hospital learning how to pull her lips apart again, her smile became a deliberate act. It wasn't a natural curve, it was a conscious construction. It was a wide, slightly asymmetrical beam that showed too many teeth, pulling the corners of her mouth upward until they nearly reached her ears. It was a smile of effort, a smile of victory over gravity. She stood before my hood, her stone-like skin gleaming under the tunnel lights. She didn't move her head, she simply existed in front of me. Her eyes were wide and bright, reflecting the amber water of the car. "Wash like 2 polished marbles. / you remembered," she said, her voice echoing against the interior of my car. She reached out. Her hand didn't touch the glass, it merged with it. The windshield rippled like a pond when her palm met the surface. I felt a sudden, intense pressure in my chest, as if she were pulling my own memories into her void. The tunnel began to shrink around us, the walls closing in like a tightening throat. / stay, she whispered. She opened her mouth wider, the smile stretching until it threatened to crack the very surface of her face. It was no longer an expression of joy, it was a physical state of being. It was the smile of something that had finally found what it was looking for and refused to let it go. / I felt myself leaning forward, my forehead pressing against the glass. The car wash tunnel began to spin, not horizontally, but vertically. The floor became the ceiling and the amber water started to fall upward. I realized then that the absence wasn't just a doorway, it was a mouth. And she was the tongue. The motion suddenly ceased. The walls fell away into nothingness. The car wash tunnel was gone. The rain was gone. I was sitting in a silent, white space with her. There were no more brushes, no more water, no more movement. She leaned in closer, her stone skin cool against the glass of my windshield. Her smile stayed perfectly fixed, wide and triumphant. She didn't blink. She just waited for me to realize that she wasn't trying to let me out of the tunnel. She was waiting for me to become part of the smile. The vocabulary of frost. I am sitting at my kitchen table this morning, the steam from my coffee still curling into the air, but my hands won't stop trembling. Last night, I lived through a silence so heavy it felt physical. We were anchored in the center of Lake Azo, a body of water so flat and still that it looked like a sheet of dark glass. The houseboat, a sturdy timber craft we called the hull, swayed with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace. My son, Leo, was 7 years old, and he had been obsessed with the walk-in closet at the stern of the boat since we set sail. It started around 8 p.m. The lake was perfectly motionless, not even a ripple to disturb the reflection of the moon. Inside the cabin, the air felt thick, as if it were waiting for something to happen. Leo was tucked into his bunk, but he wasn't sleeping. He was staring at the heavy oak door of the closet, which stood slightly ajar. "It's breathing," Leo whispered, his voice barely cutting through the hum of the water against the wood. I chuckled, leaning over to kiss his forehead. "The closet is just holding its breath, Leo. Everything inside is asleep." But as the minutes ticked by, a strange sensation began to permeate the room. It wasn't a sound, but a temperature shift. A localized chill started to seep out from the crack in the door, a sharp, biting cold that smelled faintly of crushed pine needles and old parchment. Then came the first exhale. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. There was no floating sheet or flickering flame. Instead, a plume of white vapor drifted out from the closet. It moved like smoke underwater, swirling in slow motion. As it hit the air of the cabin, it didn't just dissipate. It crystallized into shapes. I watched, mesmerized and terrified, as a word formed in the frost. Why? It was a perfect, cursive script made of tiny ice crystals. I hadn't spoken that word all day. It was a question my mind had been holding on to since breakfast. Leo sat up straight, his eyes wide. "It's waking up," he said. The closet door creaked open another inch. More vapor surged out, thicker this time. It wasn't just one word anymore. A stream of frost flowed into the room, weaving itself into a sentence. "Did you forget?" I felt a shiver run down my spine. I hadn't forgotten anything specific, but the feeling of a tiny lapse in memory had been nagging at me for hours. The entity, the winter breath, was harvesting my internal monologue. By midnight, the cabin was nearly white with frost. The vapor was no longer just drifting, it was surging. It poured out of the closet like a river of powdered diamonds, coating the furniture in a thin layer of rime. "It's almost all out," Leo whispered. He wasn't scared anymore. He looked fascinated, as if he were watching a magician pull a secret from a hat. The words began to come faster now. They weren't just my thoughts. They were the things I had meant to say but hadn't dared to utter. "I love you." The frost bloomed near the ceiling. "I'm afraid of the dark," it curled around Leo's head. "I wish I could stay forever," it stretched across the floorboards. Each word was a physical thing, a delicate sculpture of frozen air that hung in the space for a few seconds before melting into a tiny puddle of dew. The entity was exhaling my subconscious, giving a voice to the quiet parts of my soul. Around 2 a.m., the pace changed. The words became shorter, more frantic. They started appearing in clusters, overlapping like tangled vines of ice. /stay, run, wait. Then, the vapor stopped swirling and began to move toward us with intent. It didn't just hang in the air. It crawled across the floor like a pack of white hounds. It wrapped around my ankles, and for a moment, I felt a sharp, biting sting on my skin, the sensation of extreme cold meeting warm flesh. Leo reached out to touch a word that was hovering near his nose. "What does it want?" he asked. As if in response, the closet door swung wide open with a heavy thud. A final, massive burst of vapor erupted from the depths of the wood. And fabric inside. It didn't form a simple word this time. It formed a long, complex phrase that took up nearly the entire front half of the cabin. It was my most private thought, the one I hadn't even admitted to myself until that very moment. "I am being watched by the things you haven't said." The frost solidified into a brilliant, shimmering white. Then, with a soft hiss, every single word in the room began to melt simultaneously. The moisture pooled on the floorboards, turning into a thin sheen of water that reflected the dim lantern light. Silence returned to the houseboat. The lake was still. Leo fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, his breath creating tiny, normal puffs of mist in the air. I sat there for a long time in the damp quiet, watching the water drip from the ceiling. The closet door remained wide open, revealing nothing but the empty space where the breath had lived. But as I finally closed my eyes to sleep, I realized the words hadn't vanished completely. They were just waiting under the surface of the silence. I reached out and touched a spot on the floor where the final word had been. It was still slightly colder than the rest of the wood. Even though the words were gone, the feeling of being understood by something unseen remained. I realized then that the entity wasn't just an exhale from the closet, it was a collector. And as I drifted off, I felt a tiny prickle on my neck, like a cold finger tracing my spine. The breath hadn't finished with me, it had simply moved inside. The pressure of the glass face. Log entry, sublevel 9. Depth unknown. The cabin is silent, save for the rhythmic groan of the hull. I am alone in the cockpit, yet the pressure gauges have begun to lie. They no longer agree on how deep we are. One insists we are crushing under 1,000 atmospheres, while another claims we are drifting in a vacuum. It is this sensory betrayal that has forced me to record these logs. We were supposed to be a standard descent, but the architecture of the ocean began to shift outside the viewports. The terminal, a sprawling, cavernous airport hall suspended in the abyss, appeared suddenly. It was vast and empty, illuminated by humming fluorescent tubes that pulsed like a dying heart. Every gate was vacant. I stepped out of the sub into the terminal floor. I walked toward Gate 4, but when I turned back to look at where I had started, the entrance was gone. In its place stood a row of heavy velvet curtains and a grandfather clock that ticked with a metallic clack. I moved forward, expecting a corridor, but instead found a dense forest of birch trees. This is the phenomenon. Every time I leave a room, or in this case a zone, the space swaps its identity upon my departure. I exited the birch grove and entered a ballroom filled with floating chairs. I left that and stepped into a laboratory where glass speakers were arranged in perfect circles. The terminal is rearranging itself like a deck of cards being shuffled by an invisible hand. The further I walk, the more the geography defies logic. A bakery replaced a library. A balcony replaced a fountain. It is as if the airport is trying to decide what it wants to be, and each step I take forces its choice. Then I noticed the condensation. Every surface in the shifting terminal began to sweat. Beads of moisture gathered on the walls, the floor, and the ceiling, turning everything into a slick, glistening landscape. It was on these surfaces that the entity first manifested. It didn't appear all at once. At first, it was just a ripple in the fog on a large pane of glass near Gate 12. Then a shape began to push outward from the inside of the glass. Unlike a reflection, this face was built of liquid and texture. It was made of tiny, interconnected beads of water that fused together into features. It had no hair. Instead, it possessed a crown of drooping, heavy droplets. Its nose was a sharp, crystalline ridge. The most striking part were its eyes, not pupils or irises, but two deep, swirling whirlpools of moisture that seemed to spin in opposite directions. When it moved, the water on its face rippled like a disturbed pond. "Are you watching?" I whispered into the humid air. The face reacted. It didn't have a mouth initially, but as I spoke, the condensation surged toward the center of its head, forming a wide, shimmering slit. It pressed its wet cheek against the glass, creating a suction cup sound that echoed through the empty terminal. It began to move between the swapped rooms. Whenever I entered a new space, a gallery of statues, a sunken garden, a marble hallway, the face would be there, waiting on the nearest pane of glass. It moved with a strange, rhythmic pulsing, its watery features stretching and compressing as if it were breathing through the surface tension. In the gallery of statues, it was wide-eyed, the whirlpools in its sockets spinning rapidly. In the sunken garden, it seemed to droop, its crown of droplets sagging like melting wax. It started to follow me. It wasn't just a spectator anymore. It was hunting for my heat. I entered a room that felt colder than the others, a vast, white gallery with nothing but polished floor tiles and one massive wall of glass. I stopped in the center. The face appeared on the opposite side of the glass, closer than before. It didn't just sit there. It began to press its entire form against the pane, flattening itself until it was a wide, shimmering mask of liquid. I could see the texture of its skin, tiny, microscopic ridges that caught the light like fish scales. It wasn't made of water alone. It felt as though it were made of remembered water, heavy with the weight of the pressure outside. Why do you follow? I asked, my voice trembling. The face responded by expanding. The whirlpools in its eyes deepened, turning from clear to a murky, bruised violet. It didn't have a mouth to speak, but the condensation on the glass began to vibrate, producing a low-frequency hum that resonated in my chest. It surged forward. It wasn't just pushing against the glass anymore. It was beginning to seep through it. The moisture was escaping the surface, trickling downward like tears of mercury. It wanted to enter the dry room. I backed away, but the floor swapped again. I was no longer in the white gallery. I was now in a narrow corridor lined with thousands of hanging lanterns. The face followed me through the transition, maintaining its position on the wall. As I moved, it stretched, its watery body elongating like taffy to bridge the gap between the rooms. It was becoming more defined, losing its blurriness. Its nose became a sharp beak. Its crown of droplets turned into heavy, hanging stalactites. It reached out toward me. A globule of water broke free from its cheek and rolled across the floor, moving with purpose toward my feet. I realized then that it wasn't just made of water. It was a creature of the pressure, a being born of the very depth we were descending into. It was trying to solidify. I reached out and touched the glass where its face pressed against mine. The surface was freezing, colder than ice, colder than the deep ocean. As my fingers met its watery skin, the face opened its wide, shimmering slit of a mouth. It didn't speak in words, but I felt a sensation in my mind, a sudden, crushing weight, as if the entire volume of the ocean was being squeezed into my skull at once. The terminal gave one final swap. The lanterns vanished. I was left in a perfectly circular room with no doors and no windows, except for one single wall of glass that took up the entire perimeter. The face was there, occupying every inch of the glass. It had stopped being a flat mask. It was now a three-dimensional sphere of water suspended just an inch from my nose. Its whirlpool eyes were spinning so fast they became blurs of violet light. The crown of droplets hung low, almost touching my forehead. I stood perfectly still as the pressure gauges on my phantom submarine finally settled into a singular, unified number. The face opened its mouth wide, and for the first time, it let out a sound, not a hum, but a sharp, wet intake of air. It leaned forward, the liquid surface of its face rippling as it prepared to cross the final inch of distance between us. I felt the moisture reach my skin and realized that while I was watching it come out of the glass, it was also pulling me in. The pressure gauges began to lie again. The end. Subscribe for more horror stories and make sure to like.